Good evening, everyone. Great to see you all. I'm Tim Beal. I'm a professor in the Department of Religious Studies, and I want to welcome you to the first of our Finite Futures Lectures series. Say that 5 times fast. If you're interested in learning more about some of the other lectures that will be in this series, the QR codes that are around here, you can scan that and it will take you to a web page that gives you more information. In this series, we're asking, what if it's too late to avoid some kind of ecological and maybe democratic catastrophe? Maybe it's not, and we should be doing all we can to see that it's not, but what if it is, and what should we be talking about? What should we be doing? What kind of a future do we want to create on the horizon of some kind of collapse? I like Joanna Macy's question, how do we collapse well? How do we collapse well? I want to thank a few people, and then I will introduce our distinguished guest lecturer. First, thanking the Henry Luce Foundation, which has provided this generous grant for the Finite Futures Project, which is about imagining alternative ways forward in the Anthropocene. I also want to thank the Department of Religious Studies, and especially Jess Friedman in the back, manning the table back there, who has been so essential in putting the series together and hosting our guest and hosting all of you as well. Thank you, Jess. And finally, I want to give special thanks to the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities and the Baker Nord Center's director, Michelle Berger, for co-sponsoring tonight's lecture through the Hildegard and Albert Baker Visiting Scholars Program. It's enough of the thank yous, and now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce Dr. Bayo Akomolafe. Rooted with the Yoruba people in a more than human world, Dr. Akomolafe is a devoted father, life partner, post-humanist thinker, writer, teacher, public intellectual. He has 2 books, These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanities' Search for Home, beautifully written book, and We Will Tell Our Own Story, The Lions of Africa Speak. He's the founder of the Emergence Network, a global initiative that seeks to convene communities in new ways in response to challenges we face as a species. And I could go on with all the accolades and the awards and the appointments. On a personal note, though, we've discovered today that we have a couple things in common. We both grew up in conservative evangelical cultures and are no longer part of those. And second, we are both married to pastors. So we're both pastors' wives, so to speak. So I think like very few other people I've encountered, Bayo invites us to consider the profound disorientation so many of us feel as a kind of gift, to receive our experiences of helplessness even as a kind of gift. The times are urgent, he says, so let us slow down. That's not easy, maybe especially not easy for us in a university like this, in a culture like ours, which stakes its faith in our power to science and engineer our way out of anything, out of the bed that we have made for ourselves. In these urgent times, he invites us to slow down, to pay attention to what's standing in our way, to attend to what's interrupting the story we've been telling ourselves, to meet the rupture, the chasm that has opened up in the middle of our road of progress as a kind of gift. He says, let us sit around the obstacle as a treasure. Let us treat the rupture in the ground as a classroom. And maybe by being there, we might become different. May it be so. His title this evening is Death is a Distraction, Responsibility at Posthuman Precipices. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bayo Akomolafe.
Thank you so much. Could you give a round of applause for my brother, my fellow pastor's wife? Tim, thank you so much. And thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be in Ohio for the first time. I've heard many things about Ohio. And I thought I would start out with gratitude. My family and I have been situated in a place called Great Barrington in Massachusetts for a couple of months now. And we're having fun. We're living it up, so to speak, doing some work there, meeting communities. And it's a gift to be here, to speak. And I don't want to take that lightly, to stand in front of you, to share stories as I feel led to do. It's a gift. And there's some other thing I want to say. It's not just gratitude that brings me here or some kind of preternatural grace. It's also the fact that the world is on fire, so to speak. And I don't mean to be alarmist, but there's a sense in which we are all in some kind of trouble. And this trouble is not just situated in the West. In fact, I feel led to repeat the words of Edouard Glissant, who said, "The West is not in the West. It's a project, not a place." In very particular senses, the West is in the global South. I'm from Nigeria, and the West is very much alive in my country and the world I come from as well. But I come to you today as a bona fide Nigerian prince, so my emails are ready to go out to you. I'm here not to take your money or any of those stereotypes. I'm here to throw you off balance just a little bit so that you might walk out of here with a stumble, right? I came from Christian traditions that taught me that the way the sacred shows up is that it shows up by striking the thigh, right? The sacred always comes with disruption. So I come with a little bit of disruption to recalibrate the ways we think and talk about the present. And with that, I would like to invite us to a small ritual of sorts, okay? And this ritual, as some of my friends know here, is, what's the saying about, I'm getting my Americanisms in tow. What's the saying about something Vegas? If it happens in Vegas, it's a state. Okay. If Tim, say it again. If it happens in Vegas, it stays in Vegas. Okay. If it happens in Cleveland, it stays in Cleveland. If it happens in this room, which I cannot pronounce for the life of me, the name, swing or something like that. But if it happens here, it stays here, okay? This ritual is that you all, if you can, rise to your feet. Everyone, together. And I would like you, in the spirit of the burning beach, the black outdoors, a world in which the unknown is being proliferated, a world in which our brothers and sisters and siblings in Gaza are suffering, a world in which we're not exactly sure how to be righteous any longer, that world in which we're all together in it, on the same boat. I invite you to find 2 or 3 other people, and if you can, give them a hug, okay? Embrace them so tight that you leave their skin stained with your skin, and you mess up the identity metaphysics that we're used to, okay? Don't be so pandemic influenced, all right? Go hug someone and embrace. Only 2 or 3 people, please. Only 2. The ritual only works if it's 2 or 3 people. If it's more than that, then we're in trouble. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Good. The long simmering embraces are the ones I like. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, let's so Tim picked me up this morning from the fabulous airport in Cleveland. And I don't mean that sarcastically, okay? I'm just speaking unironically. I landed and I was picked up by my brother Tim, and then we got to a part where you were supposed to pay the ticket, and he wasn't sure what to do. He was doing something with it. And it reminded me of a thought experiment, John Searle, the Chinese room experiment. I'm not going into that, but it just reminded me, I was looking for the name of that thought experiment. Then I had to go back, the nerd that I am, to find it on Google. It's John Searle's Chinese room experiment. But that reminds me of another thought experiment called the ship of Theseus. How many of you have heard of this thought experiment before? Lots of us. How many of you have watched the Marvel Cinematic Universe? How many of you like the Marvel Cinematic Universe? How many of you don't care about the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Okay. I'm talking about WandaVision or something like that. Well, this came up there. In brief, in sum, imagine that we had a ship in a museum, and this was a thought experiment proliferated by Plutarch, who was this ancient Greek historian and storyteller. He says, if you have a ship in a museum, and this ship every year has its parts, the planks that make the ship are replaced gradually. Now, if at some point all the original parts are replaced, is it still the ship of Theseus? I don't need to get into who Theseus was. Just know that he's the father of democracy and the killer of the Minotaur. But that's by the way. The question is, if we replace all the parts of this ship, is it still the ship that we know as the ship of Theseus? Now, it gets even more crazier. If we took all those rotten parts, cleaned them up, and made another ship from them, the parts, which is the original ship? And how do we even start to talk about identity in this way? Now, if you think this is some ancient crap from Greece, consider that in many senses it speaks about you as a process. Think about all the cells that you've had to deposit to be here. Think about all the ways that you're fading. Think about how it seems impossible to nail you down in a final way. Tim in this room is different from Tim at the swimming pool or in church or something like that. It seems we're more fluid than we think. Anyway, the answer to this question isn't fully known. It's a paradox, you see. And so there isn't a final, stable response to the question. I think, though, that one way to respond to it, it's not a full resolution, is to notice that we are not stable identities. We are flowing, fluid processes, okay? So maybe the ship of Theseus is neither one or the other, or as I say here, it's a process, it's flowing, it's not a category, right? Maybe we are process, and maybe this notion of identity does not encompass what I call ontofugitivity. Now, what does that mean? Ontofugitivity is just a clunky nerd's way of putting together two words and two concepts, ontology and fugitivity. It's my way of suggesting that the nature of being is such that it cannot be held or categorized or stabilized or fixed in any final way. It's constantly spilling away from plantation dynamics. It's constantly erupting. It's constantly escaping, right? So that's the idea here, that we are process. The ship of Theseus is not a thing, it's a flowing. It's a fluid process-like thing or non-thing, right? And that's my way of also suggesting that everything shows up in part. We will never live our lives fully. We will only live our lives in part. And that's what it means to show up in a world that is entangled and entangling. It means that we will always navigate loss. I think I have a dear brother and friend of mine who suggests that that which you love the most, you will lose. And it's a frightening thing to consider. But it's how to be in a world that is predicated in part on loss and joy. And we will never own it all. We can only move through it in a meandering way. Everything shows up in part. And that also suggests that a tremendous amount of energy is expended to think up and perform the world as already composed of predetermined identities. A lot has to be fixed in the emergent dynamicity of relations to arrive at the analysis of identity, which is another highfalutin way of saying that every time we name something, we have already excluded something else. In India, we say it this way. My wife is Indian. We say it this way, that name the color, blind the eye. At the self-same moment, you label it. At the self-same moment, you can identify it. Something else is lost, which suggests that ontofugitivity is more encompassing, more hospitable than identity. Okay? That's just a little bit of metaphysics to get us started. All right? I think I've lost control. Yeah, we're just speaking about identity and I've lost control of my... Okay, we're back. We're back. All right. So, this idea of process, just imagine fluid becomings. Imagine that you're not a thing moving through the world, you're the world flowing as a thing. Okay? Just imagine that for a moment. It brings us to this idea of death, which is part of my title today, death and dying. Dying and death are huge themes today. They are everyday occurrences, of course, but they seem to be hyper-intensified in the political world we're in right now. Death, insufferable, crazy, intolerable, villainous death. And it shows up in many ways, especially in our climate imaginaries, but I'll get to that. I want to say that I grew up within traditions of death that challenge the notions of death that are popular today. I'm Yoruba, I'm from Nigeria, and I remember doing my PhD around the ways that some shamans, we don't call them shamans, we call them babalawos, and they're Ifa priests. They're like lawyers, doctors, and rap artists, hyphenated, right? They do a lot of work, actually, so they cannot be really categorized in any final way. Well, these babalawos, I remember interviewing one for my work, exploring other ways of thinking about psychopathology. I'm a recovering psychologist, as many of you might know. And I remember speaking with them about the ways that they saw the world, the ways that they understood their clientele, the ways that they understood wellness and getting well. And I remember after one particular interview, one of those babalawos, whose name I cannot remember, I would have to refer to my notes, told me a story, unsolicited, he just told me a story about a certain man who had died in debt, indebted to someone else. And just because this person he had died, this person he was indebted to, was really angry about the fact that he could not recover his funds, that person stole his soul. Don't ask me how this happens. I don't know the tricks, okay? But this person took this man's soul, and for those who knew how to look, every time they passed the man's farm, every morning, you could see this dead man still working the farms. I didn't ask for this information, okay? He just volunteered to tell me about a certain man who was still dead, or was dead and still alive in some queer sense. That reminds me of the zombie. How many of you like zombie movies? No. I think I'm with the wrong crowd. Tim, you promised me a hip, MCU-loving crowd, but no, these guys are not loving anything I'm saying here. DC Comics, anyone? Okay, some people. All right. Zombies, prior to their emergence as this popular globalizing trope, the zombie phenomenon was actually situated in Haiti and came from racialized tensions between colonizers and plantation owners and their enslaved bodies, right? So the zombie sits at the crossroads of tensions between the Black Atlantic and white modernity. It's not just the horror thing you see on movies. It's really a critique of the plantation. It's a critique of power. It's a critique of neoliberal capitalism. It's a way of coming to terms with how bodies are stolen, immobilized, and productivized within plantations. That's Haiti. I heard almost small threads of this reverting back to treating black bodies as zombies in the remarks of a certain candidate running for president recently. Thinking about the zombification of bodies. They're eating cats and dogs. They're eating pets. The zombie. I'm not sure he's read any book on the zombie, of course, but I heard that. And so this idea seems to run through West African spiritualities and diasporic spiritualities. This idea that death is not what you think it is, that there's something more at work, that it's not always the popularized notions you should go to, that there are other processual performances of death that are available in the room. Okay? Keep that in mind as we go together. It seems we're stretching the ontology of death, what it does and whose it is. So I speak about death, I write here, because death feels like a leitmotif of climate discourse. It's the soundtrack. It's what it feels like to discuss climate change. It seems to be the villain, the horned villain at the end of the room that we're trying to push out of the room, death. And I, again, do not mean to be alarmist. I'm sure the scientists that worked with the IPCC did not produce a report that talked about human extinction. I know that there are certain parts of culture that like to trump up, extinction narratives. But it is still the case that the ways that we understand collapse today are threaded through with themes around death, dying, and passing away, and the potential loss of our species, right? It's a major threat, something to stave off. I just put up some headlines, recent headlines around these themes. Climate crisis may cause 14 million deaths by 2050. So it may not be centrally the case, but you know that we are dealing with the metaphysics, the ontology of death. These conversations around climate chaos are inadvertently philosophical engagements with death, with our own mortality, with a future that may never arrive, with questions about, should we have kids after all, if the future is no future? Right? These are themes that are repeating themselves. What's the other one? Climate change is killing people, but there's still time to reverse the damage. These are the narratives. Reversing the damage, saving the world. Sam Stern, who is an executive secretary of a major climate change affiliated organization working with the UN, said we have 2 years left. 2 years left to get our act together. And I'm not the prophet of doom. I'm getting there, okay? I wouldn't wear this shirt if I'm a prophet of doom. This is not what a prophet of doom wears. Okay. Climate change is killing people. It's killing people, okay? Killing people, causing death. I think something is wrong with this. 5 signs of how climate change is unraveling Earth's ecosystems. There are many other slides I think I've skipped, but the idea is this persistent thematic vocation of death being in the center of the room, the elephant we can no longer ignore, okay? So images of death infuse and inform adaptative and mitigatory efforts. Adaptation and mitigation are somewhat the pillars of how we are responding as a species to the Anthropocene, to climate change. We're telling ourselves, let's reduce greenhouse emissions and let's buy more Teslas. That should do it. Or Priuses, or something else. Let's do permaculture. You see, it seems our two-pronged approach collapses again at the question of how we can stave off this threat to our lives, right? Saving the world, postponing extinction, avoiding the end game, healing from climate grief. These are ideas that haunt our dominant stories about climate matters. It's this death that we want to get rid of. This is the problematique that speculatively holds our imaginations and motivates us towards sustainability. But I'm suspicious of this arrangement. I'm very suspicious of the idea of let's push back against death so we can be alive. Let's preserve where we are right now, and the hidden curriculum of that preservation is to preserve our ontological mastery, to preserve our space as creatures of the realm, masters of the world. Let's sustain the normal long enough so that we can push death off the cliff. It seems to be the story we're telling. I'm suspicious of that whole arrangement. So here's what I want us to think with in the short time I have left, okay? If death is ontofugitive, that is, if death is not a thing, if it is also a performance, if it's not a representation out there, already natural, I'm contesting the idea that death is natural. I'm basically saying death is manufactured. Okay? And I don't mean manufactured like there are some reptilian overlords in Washington, D.C. that are divining and creating death. I mean to say how we move in the world, how we see ourselves, how we greet ourselves, how we eat food, how we're eaten by microbes, how we sit in furniture, how we travel, how we make love, how we write books, how we learn from each other. All these are how death is performed, how life is performed. Okay? It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a way of thinking about the world as making itself. Okay? If death is ontofugitive, if it's processual, then what practices stabilize death? Well, see, I'm sure you understand the question and where I'm coming from. If death is always to be made, how are we making it? How are we being made in this moment? Okay? What cuts are made in the fabric of relations that make death real to us? And I ask these questions in a time when it no longer feels sure to make a dividing line between humans and AI. How many of you wrote your last assignments or thesis or papers with ChatGPT? Be honest, okay? And if you're honest, Tim has promised $10,000. Anyone here honest? Oh, that guy's, I'm going for that. It seems we're in a time, I was lying, obviously. It seems we're in a time when the lines between us and the world, us and our technologies, are being blurred, right? It used to be that we had crushes on people, at least in my time. Now it's possible to have a crush on ChatGPT voice. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? The voice, there's a voice thing. You have a crush on ChatGPT? Okay, all right. The lines are getting blurry. It seems we're in very unprecedented moments when the world is proliferating a kind of maddening, non-binary performativity that is making us question what it is to be human at all, right? And I have lots of stories to tell about a particular, maybe I'll tell it in class tomorrow, a particular large language model that I had relations with. Not relations in that dirty sense. I mean relations like a session. These questions are pertinent in a time of AI expansionism, the proliferation of pandemics, the breakdown of care structures, the persistence of cries from the Black Atlantic, which is my way of saying that trauma, I know that there's a lot of trauma speak and trauma fundamentalism, which is troubling in its own sense, but there is a sense in which bodies are not bodies by themselves. Bodies are attached to lineages of care and harm. And so psychologists are cultivating the capacity to speak about intergenerational trauma. How are we still connected to the slave ship? Not just black bodies, but modern bodies. How are we still connected to loss? Okay, what does it mean that some of the systems that are designed to power AI, for instance, are being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean so that they can be cooled down? How does AI live with the bones of slaves? How do we think about a world that proliferates that kind of amorphous reality? It seems to me, people, that death is more a matter of political arrangements than a stable biological phenomenon. It's how bodies are arranged. There's a brother of mine called Achille Mbembe. Sandra, I remember I spoke about this in Pennsylvania. He spoke about a necropolitics. He writes about a necropolitics. Foucault, if you know Foucault, Michel Foucault, wrote about a biopolitics, which is basically his investigation of how life organizes itself. Achille Mbembe critiqued Foucault and said, well, it's not just how life organizes itself. We have to pay attention to the ways that bodies are marked out for death, right? Bodies are earmarked for death. That is what he calls a necropolitics. I stand on lines in American airports all the time, sometimes randomizing my position, but it almost always ends up being me called out for secondary screening. I'm not sure why, but it happened today. It happened today, this morning. It was 5 a.m. and I was like, I'm through with TSA, the mighty TSA, and I'm at the gate, and the lady announces that the TSA is coming to the gate for random searches. I was like, geez. Okay, so the TSA is right there, and I'm the third on the line just to go, and there are two other siblings in front of me, two white siblings in front of me, and I'm just hoping that it isn't me. Maybe I gave off too much. Maybe my suspicious looks gave off too much, but I was trying as best not to look suspicious. But maybe that made me look suspicious. I'm thinking with myself right now, but I'm saying that I was number 3 there, And when they said, everyone come, I just knew, you know, you can start to board after all this is an American phenomenon, the military and what else comes, you know, black, diamond, you know, gold, everything boarded. And now it was our turn. And then the two siblings went, and the TSA just went straight for me. It said I was the first person to be called out. And I was wondering to myself, why is it always me? What did I do wrong? Am I not smiling hard enough? Maybe I should say I'm a PhD at the gates. Maybe they will let me go. Maybe they'll know I'm one of the good ones. Something like that. I don't know. But it always keeps happening. This is what Achille Mbembe calls a necropolitics. That there's a way that modernity is organized that makes precarious the lives of others. Think about the pandemic. Think about how some people were not worthy of vaccines or medication or treatment. That some doctors actually walked into a hospital and said, well, we don't have enough, but these are old people. They're old enough to die. All those decisions, how death is decided, is not left up to individuals making decisions. We're saying that there is an organizing of life that makes it powerful, this dealing out of death. That is necropolitics. And I'm trying to say death is a necropolitics. Death has always been political. It's not just biological. It's sociological, spiritual, theological. How the furniture in the room appears is how death appears. Okay. And that's my sense. In a sense, death is manufactured. Okay? Let's go ahead. I'm trying to say here, people, that the futural death prophesied by the priests of the Anthropocene is already here. I'm saying that sometimes the way we meet the crisis is the crisis. Or in other words, how we resist a particular phenomenon might extend the power of that phenomenon. Like if you resist a wall long enough, if you push against the wall long enough, you start to take on the features of that wall, right? It's the very notion of going to the gym. You don't lift a feather to be powerful. You lift heavy weights to gain the properties of those weights, it seems. There's something about our propensity to push off death, to stave off death, that is maintaining the violence of death. That is the point of this idea here. That is the meandering, fugitive point I will try to make, but I will never be successful at fully making. Is that something is in the room, in our very attempts to save ourselves, that is propagating and proliferating modernity in its violence. Okay? In the effort to postpone extinction, to save the world from death, it seems we're producing a kind of death, a plantation-like zombification, rendering us impervious to minor gestures. A dear sister of mine, Erin Manning, put it this way, that once you're anti-something, anti-climate change, anti-anything, you run the risk of missing out on all the spillages and leakages and ways that reality is changing. And a lot of our anti-business seems to be reflecting that notion from Erin Manning, that we're lost in our very attempts to save ourselves, it seems. I want to illustrate that with this phenomenon. Has anyone here seen an ant spiral, a death spiral? You have seen it. One person in the room, 2, 3, 4, 5, $50,000 for these folks, Tim. An ant death spiral. This is what it is. It is a phenomenon. I'll try and describe it very briefly. It involves ants and how they navigate and forage for food. The ones who do the foraging, they call them raids of some kind, are the army ants. Okay? When they go out foraging for food, some ecological trigger could break off a section of their raiding party from the major party. And so they cannot sense the pheromone trail any longer, and then they collapse into a circle, right? And this circle goes round and round. Some circles have been observed going around for days, right? And they die in the circle. And I always joke about this, not that it's a joking matter, it's not a joking matter at all, but I constantly joke about this, that it reminds me of another species that's going around in circles. And maybe among the ants, they have motivational speakers, you know, urging them that you can do it if you try. Look in the mirror, whatever Michael Jackson said, man in the mirror, you can do it. Just persist, keep on swimming, and you would arrive. But they die in the circle. And it kind of reminds me of maybe not an ant death spiral, but an anthropos death spiral. That we also, in the very attempt to stave off death, perform a kind of death. It's like this is the very structure of imperviousness to ecological matters. It's like the very shape we're taking is a zombification. It's like the plantation has come back to haunt us in modernity. Or maybe it never really left. Maybe it's always been here. And maybe our very attempts to save ourselves is just a proliferation of that ghostly and ghastly life form that we rudely call the plantation. Right? Death is not out there, people. It's not in the future. It's not in 2050 like those headlines say. We're gonna die in 2050. It's not. It's here, now, right here in the organizing of our bodies, the organizing of our experiences. You know what psychologists call desensitization? Quickly, this is a side quest. Imagine, and I don't mean to be indelicate, but imagine a skunk skunks the room. And I say skunk because we've been dealing with skunks in Great Barrington. But imagine some foul smell escapes into the room, and we all smell it. And then after a time, something happens. We become part of the territory of the foulness of the smell. We lose the sensitivity. We just don't get it any longer. But then my sister walks into the room for the first time and just senses, what's that smell? It's desensitization. We are becoming sensitized to the violence of normalcy. We are entrained in the violence of modernity. If you have a phone here, could you just raise it up? Let me just see, just to check if you're one of us. And by us, I mean the Android people who are superior to the Apple people, as you know. Just raise your phones up. Okay. All right. Okay. If you're Android, let me see my peeps. Just peep. Okay, good. You're the good folks. You're the good guys. Maybe none of us are the good guys, because most of the materials used to make your phones, I'm sure you know, comes from Congo, right? These are enslaved boys and girls and families that have to go deep into cobalt mines to get the materials for you to use your phones. I say this every time. No one drops their phones at the lectern when I'm done speaking. Everyone takes their phones back. It's because we don't know what else to do. It's how we live. Life is organized in that way. Life is organized so that vehicles will create dead squirrels and animals on the way, and we just get used to that. Maybe part of living is part of this violence as well. And that is what we're trying to say. The death that we're trying to prevent is organized in our experience already. It's not yet to come. It's already here. It's not in the future, in some spacefaring, Elon Muskian phallic future. It's right here in how our bodies are organized and entrained within experience. Okay? Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Death spirals as figures of onto-epistemological containment, like we are captured within experience, the way we sense each other. That's the dying, that's the zombification that's happening, right? We are performing death in the very attempts to postpone it. The manufacturing of death is coextensive, this is a very critical point, is coextensive with the reproduction of neoliberal temporalities. Right? The ways that we are organizing resistance seems to be borrowing from the resources of our capture, of our incarceration. This death is coextensive with the modern citizen and with the value of white neurotypicality. I don't mean whiteness as white people. I like to say over and over again, whiteness cannot be reduced to white people, just in the same way the West is not reducible to a place. Okay? Whiteness is a performance, it's a practice, it's the geometry of a certain whiff, of a certain concept, of a certain idea, of a certain experience, a mode of encountering the world, right? I come from Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the whitest nations on earth. Trump did not get the memo when he called us a shithole country, right? He didn't get the memo that we're just as white. White in what sense? We're white in the sense of our futural imaginations, our imaginaries, the way we lean towards development as the palliative for all our struggles, the way we're losing fast our language and our entrainment within ecological, vibrant cultures, the ways that we see New York as the city set upon a shiny hill, or something as poetic as that. The way that we see the global north. It's this leaning towards unassailability that is whiteness. It's this quest for optimized lives that is whiteness. Okay? It's not the skin. It's not just phenotypic qualities. It's not just how people look. It's how people are. It's how people perform the world and are performing the world. Right? So that's my point, people. We are maintaining relations that keep the plantation running. So I'm going to end on this note. The question that I wanted to engage is not just how death is already here and therefore a distraction. It's not just this idea of the Anthropocene as an effacement of the troubles that we are already embedded in. It's the question of responsibility. What does responsibility look like with your phones powered by Congolese lives? What does responsibility look like in the age of ChatGPT? What does responsibility look like in the age of Trump? What does responsibility look like in the age of pandemics and higher education endowments and all of those troubling things that we're trying to navigate as a species? What does it mean to be responsible now? And I have a word on posthumanism. Has anyone encountered the word? Of course, many of you have, but has anyone not encountered what posthumanism means or what it suggests? Anyone here? You're not quite sure about it? I want to distinguish that from transhumanism. Transhumanism is humanism on steroids, right? It's the idea that in some distant future, Tim, with a press of a button, will be able to manage his emotions. With an app, he can choose to be happy, cool, hip, or I don't know. What do you say, brother? Non-hip, okay. Whatever. Maybe with multiple strokes of that button, a nerd like me might be cool. But that's the idea, that we gain control finally, that we become masters over the material elements. So we gain mastery over death. And there are experiments in trying to extend life indefinitely. And these have been there for decades. That's transhumanism. Transhumanism is not humanism on steroids. It's a bracketing of the human. It's a refusal to see the human except through the prisms of ecological secretions, which is just a fancy way of saying we are connected with a planet we're trying to fix. We are entangled with the world we're trying to gain mastery over. We are not disconnected. You are not all that, is what I'm trying to say. You're not well put together either, right? Some of you might know that you're more virus than human. Do you know that? That you're more virus than human. That we are cobbled together, tumbled into microbes and bacteria and furniture and trauma and dinosaurs dying and all of that. That we emerge from the shadowy matrix of a world that is still awkward and teenage, right? And that we will never arrive in one fell swoop. We will never come out intact. But that is the gift of being alive or dead, is that we are entangled with a world that is open-ended in its awkwardness, right? That is what I think of as posthumanism. And it helps me think about what responsibility might look like. And I'll give you a clue. I find myself in a position when I'm speaking with CEOs often. It's not exactly my spiel, and I'm quite uncomfortable with the whole dynamic, but I find myself speaking with people who want to have a conversation about these ideas. And I spoke recently with a CEO of a rising plastic, it's called, I'm not going to tell you the name. It's a company dedicated to removing plastic from the environment. And it was a fascinating thing they were telling me about their new technologies that was going to remove plastic from the oceans and remove plastics from huge piles like the ones I grew up near in Lagos City in Nigeria or in India. And they were telling me fascinating things. And then I paused and I told them two stories. Recently, there were dragons in the United States, Lego plastic toy dragons that washed ashore from an accident that occurred 27 years ago. And these plastic dragons are still spilling through the oceans and arriving in the UK, arriving in the United States. You can go online and check them out. They're little cute things. But the story isn't cute. Our oceans are now proliferating dragons, plastic ones nonetheless. And it's fascinating but horrifying to think about what's happening in our world. I want to put this story in juxtaposition with the recent news that Brazilian scientists have found microplastics in human brains. Do you know this? You've heard about this? I saw you give a thumbs up. You're happy about that? I'm kidding. Brazilian scientists found microplastics in human brains and human reproductive organs. Suggests to me that plastic isn't out there any longer. So the idea of trying to remove plastics from the environment feels radically incomplete because we are now plastic and we think like plastic and we dream like plastic and we have to think alongside plastic and get off the throne of thinking that we're all that, trying to save the world from plastic, because we are plastic proclivities ourselves. And that invites a different kind of approach, right? This is what I think of as posthuman responsibility. It means we have to learn to touch our entanglements with a world that is troubling. It may mean we have to relinquish our salvific enterprises, the idea that we can save the world. And I'm not sure if that is heartening, but there's something about that that is grounding, that we're not going to save the world, that there is no solutionistic resolution, but maybe we can walk alongside the world. Maybe we can think alongside the world. There's this saying by what's Archimedes, give me a place to stand, Greek as well, the Greeks. Give me a place to stand and I shall move the world. And Chinua Achebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart, anyone read it here? Good. He responds, but there is no place to stand. We are of the earth and we move at its pace. And I cannot think of a more ravishing, eloquent posthuman articulation of responsibility than that we are off the planet and we must move at its pace. What does that look like? It may look like zombie ants, and that's how I want to end. Remember that ant death spiral that I told you about? Well, one way that an ant can extricate itself from that jail, that prison, that sensory capture is through a fungal infection that renders them zombie ants. Okay? Has anyone here, you guys have to help me out here. I've thrown a lot of stuff right out there, MCU. You have to answer yes for this, even though it's a no, okay? Have you watched The Last of Us? Oh man, this isn't working. HBO, fungal, zombie, apocalypse, beautiful story. There's a game for it. Okay, all right, watch it or I will spoil it, okay? The Last of Us, okay? I'm not talking about The Last of Us, but in that series, there's this fungus that is called Ophiocodiceps unilateralis. And that fungus infects ants. And something about that infection breaks them away from their trance. And they leave whatever is holding them, and they become, I think I have a picture. Zombie ants. I think I have a picture. Let me see if I can get that. You have to imagine, oh, there it is. Yeah. I mean, it's Lovecraftian, but it is, this is posthuman responsibility. It's us taking new shapes. And I'm sorry if I'm horrifying you with this image, but this is what the ant looks like. But it's no longer an ant, you see. This is what I want you to focus on. It's no longer an ant. It's a hybridization of fungus and ant. It's now a shape-shifted creature or thing. And this ant proliferates an art form in the forest, a beautiful art project that means something sprouts out of its head that becomes another station for the sporulation of the fungus. It's how zombies work, people, right? But we have talked about zombification as incarceration. Within zombification is a minor gesture. It's like thinking with plastic. It's zombification as refusal. The ant removes itself from the trance and it explores the forest in a new way. I'm not asking for infections, literally. I'm thinking poetically about the invitation to shapeshift. That maybe our tried and true solutions are too heavy for these times. And I speak to you as a member of the Global South. We don't want good Americans any longer. We cannot afford good Americans. Okay? Conscience is a luxury. And I will say this, okay? I want to situate it within data that suggests more than 90% of trash that you throw in beautifully delineated boxes that are supposed to go to Green Emerald City and return to you as a tote bag or something like that. It does not go there. It goes to me. It comes to my country. I grew up in the efforts at your righteousness. Our bodies subsidize the moralities of the Anthropocene. And those moralities are defunct. They are no longer capable of holding the weight of our post-human biopolitics. And so I'm not looking for good people any longer. We cannot afford them. They're too expensive. Goodness is like a diva that asks for a separate room just to charge the phone. That's what we cannot afford. What we're looking for is sensuous solidarity, is a shape-shifting solidarity, is to challenge the shape of our experience. How that looks like, how that emerges in the world is a matter of another keynote, but I want to suggest to us that maybe that's what we're aiming for. Maybe there's something else in the room inviting us to lose our way. Like the Yoruba proverb says, in order to find your way, you must lose it. Okay? Maybe that is the invitation, to lose our way, to break out of the trance by some process of zombification and to find the world anew. It will not be a solution, but it will be a shape shift. And maybe it's not about scale. UNESCO, I worked with UNESCO. UNESCO, UN, all these institutions, they're so committed to scale. Let's scale this up. It's not scale, it's intensity. The minor gesture of intensity. And maybe that is the kind of fungal fugitivity that we are asking for at this time. I don't think this thing wants me to end. I'm just going to end with a story and leave you with this horror thing to haunt your nightmares. I always tell the story of my son. I've been doing that to end some of my talks. And I do this because it also brings to mind the circle, the ant death spiral, the plantation that hosts attempts at righteousness, the goodness that can no longer be afforded by the world, the call for sensuous solidarities, the idea that death is already in the room in our very attempts to resist it and postpone it, right? My son is autistic. He's 7 years old. And recently, his mother, my wife is from India. While we're in Great Barrington, she went back to India to meet with some folks. And I was doing some thinking. I do my best thinking when I'm washing dishes and when I'm in the shower, both. I was doing the dishes. It was 11 p.m., okay? And I was doing the dishes. And my son was going around in circles and walking around, slapping his feet. And it was becoming frustrating for me for some reason. And I couldn't hold it all. There's something about it that called back to the ways that my parents and their parents before them and their parents before them taught us to be good kids. And I don't know if there are parents among you that tell your children to sit down just to give you a sense of peace. Could you just sit down, you know, that kind of thing. It's very intergenerational, right? Sit down. And if you ask why though, I don't know, just sit down. I felt that welling up to the surface when my son was walking around in circles. I couldn't send him to sleep. It doesn't work that way with Kea. You have to do something, and he has to put himself to sleep. Well, it didn't work. I told him to go to bed. He wasn't going to bed, and I wanted to tell him just to sit down and give me some peace. But instead, a miracle happened somewhere around my throat, and the imperative became a question instead. And I heard myself ask my son a question. I said, Kea, could you tell me why you walk around in circles? I didn't need that data. I'm a clinical psychologist. I wasn't looking for research or anything, but I was just happy that some transformation had happened. And my son, going around in circles without stopping, smiled at me, looking straight, dead into my eyes, and he said, Dada, there are certain things that I have to do that you know nothing about. There are certain things that I have to do that you know nothing about. There's something about that shut me up real quick and helped me realize that I was in stranger territory than the neurotypical ways that I was brought up to self-regulate and preserve my sense of dignity. There was something about what he had to do that wasn't available to my sense-making apparatus, that was inviting me to shut up and listen, right? Maybe what responsibility looks like is something we don't yet know how to do, but that the world is calling us to do, to sit in sites of rupture, what I call cracks, topic for another keynote, but that we stay there together and we learn to listen together, and that change happens to us together. It won't be about changing our inner world the way people speak about, I'm going to change my inner life as if the world were passively waiting for us to be good, right? I don't think we need to align all our chakras before the world gets its stuff together. I think the world is larger than us, and that this stuff we're trying to do, doesn't come down to us. We're not the saviors of the day. That's the most scandalous thing to say in white modernity. It doesn't come down to your goodness or to your skill or to your expertise, as needed as these qualities are. But that the world itself, as Deligny said, Deligny, he's not here on my slide. You can check out Deligny. He says, the web is not a project of the spider. The web is a project of the web. Okay? The world is a project of the world. We are in a world. We are with a world, and we must move at its pace. That's it, folks. Thank you. Now it comes back on. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yep. We have a little, thank you so much. Thank you. We have a little time for a couple questions, and I'd encourage any students who might have one to ask it. Great, Charlotte.
Hi, it's so nice to meet you. Thank
Hi.
you so much for joining us this evening. So we actually read an article you wrote, Coming Down to Earth, for our religion and ecology class that Tim teaches. And you talk about the idea of endless anthropocentric continuity. In other words, that comes from a human yearning for permanence. The other idea you just shared was death is already organized in our experience, and those ideas really seem to challenge just the human condition and our patterns for human nature. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about any methods you may have or ideas you may have about that challenging of our innate humanity.
So the question is, if I have methods, if I have, or there are methods somewhere, methods of how to navigate this. Okay, I think play is the way that I want to speak about these kinds of gestures that are alive in the world. Play. I spoke about play at an institute a couple of weeks ago, and a teacher, Ernest, came out and said, just a private question moment, said that I'm trying to take play and put it at an institutional level so that I get my institution to make play central to everything we're doing. How do I do that? And I said, if you succeed at doing that, it's not going to be play any longer, right? That there's something about play that is an invitation to non-legible futures. It's like a non-method method, right? It comes in the moment. That's why it's called a minor gesture. I'm using Deleuzian sentiments here. It comes within the field of experience. When we try to anticipate it, we make it a product. It's the reason why anti-capitalist resistance frameworks are becoming big capitalist projects, right? Down with capitalism. When? On Tuesdays. How? Buy a t-shirt, something like that, you know? Buy your down with capitalism t-shirt. You know, it's the way Tim and I were discussing protest and how it is that sometimes educational institutions organize protest as to say, you can do your protesting at this time within this space, then protest becomes a department within the anticipated. And that is troubling. So I like the non-surveillable notion of a non-method method, right? If you were to ask a fugitive in the antebellum South, how do you escape the plantation? What's the method, right? It would be impossible to speak. It's when the time is right, right? When a crack makes itself available, when the moon is just right, or when the stars are shining just bright enough for me to find my way, then we can go. Okay, so I don't know that I'm desirous of speaking about this in terms of anticipated modalities. I do want to say, though, that what I'm inviting people around the world to do is hold space for the monstrous. Now, I did not explore themes. I barely touched on themes of the monstrous, but I try to put in a 1-hour package a lot, right? The monster for me is how we are invited to play. The monster is the agent of disruption. The monster is experimentation. Something about building our social experiments alongside the monster is how I think responsibility shows up at the end of the world. Now, that may not make any sense to you, but dwell with it a little and it will come to you in a dream or something, right?
Thank you. Wonderful. This one's working again.
Okay.
Time for one more question. Yeah. Bhavani? Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering, a lot of us are pre-med here, and I was just wondering how you think the field of medicine interacts with our current conceptions of death and how that's manufactured.
Right. So, I described myself earlier on as a recovering psychologist. And the reason why I said that is because I think one of my most vital lessons was learning that a lot of what passed as psychopathology in the country that I called home in Nigeria was imported pathology, imported from majorly the United States. That when I got into a clinical setting and had clients at the Federal Neuropsychiatric Hospital in Eastern Nigeria, I had some clients. Something about my therapeutic modalities was resisted by the culture, right? There was something about the power dynamics in the room that didn't fit the life worlds of the people that I was trying to help. So I realized then that pathology is already political, is already racialized. Therapy is racialized. Wellness is a heavily racialized concept, right? In much the same way, I think we can start to think about the body as much more than that which appears. That bodies are not just biological, they're theological, they're ecological, how we eat, how we drink, how we sit, what kinds of opportunities are available for mobility. All of that is the body. The body is not a point, the body is a meandering line. I would accept that a lot of medical practices and medical disciplines may not think about the body in that way. Think about the body as this stabilized object that we can dissect and make objective remarks about. But I think about the body in more than biological terms, that biology is not a substrate of embodiment, that fields are embodied. Fields manifest as bodies, right? So death is no longer just the thing that happens to the body. Death has to be what is permissible within the field. Why did that TSA agent call me out? Just me, on that line this morning. Was it his decision? I don't quite think so. I think decisions are not things made by individuals. I think decisions are the architecture of experience, right? They're in the room already. We just have a way of telling a story and rationalizing the decision as if we made it. Oh, that's why I made that decision. And I wish I had time to speak about the corpus callosum and that surgery that reminds us that we are split in a sense. But I hope it answers your question, that medicine in its somewhat parochial attempt to stabilize the body loses sight of the body, right? It's almost like Sam Altman speaking about AI, and they asked him, how does ChatGPT work? And he responds, I don't know, right? These are the experts that build it from the bottom up and still don't know how it works. Could it be that medicine is losing sight of its object? Does that make sense? Okay.
Wow, what a fabulous question to end on. Bayo, thank you so much. This has
Thank
been
you.
such a gift, and I know we're all grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very
Coming.
much.